I recently experienced one of the most painful betrayals of my life. My parents secretly withdrew my application to my dream college, Stanford, to protect my younger brother's feelings. I didn't know how to process what they had done at first. All I could feel was shock, anger, and hurt. The people who were supposed to support me had sabotaged my future, and I had no idea why they would do something so drastic. It all started a few months ago when I applied to various business schools. I had my heart set on Stanford, a prestigious university that would help me achieve my long-term goals. I worked hard to maintain good grades, built up my extracurriculars, and prepared everything I needed to submit a strong application. I wasn't overly confident, but I was hopeful. I wanted to attend a school far from home, as my relationship with my parents was already strained, and I wanted a fresh start. I have a younger brother, and while I've never had a great relationship with him, I never thought my future would be jeopardized for his sake. My brother has struggled academically for years, largely because he is more interested in socializing and how others perceive him than in his studies. Despite his constant failures, my parents have always doted on him, making excuses for his lack of effort. While I found it frustrating, I tried not to let it affect me too much, until recently. After months of waiting for responses from the colleges I had applied to, I started receiving acceptance letters. One by one, I heard back from several schools, all of which had accepted me. I was thrilled, knowing that I had options for my future. However, one thing puzzled me: I hadn't heard anything from Stanford. Even though rejection is tough, colleges typically send out some form of communication, whether it's an acceptance or rejection. I waited, checked my email every day, and even checked the admissions portal, but there was nothing. As my friends began discussing their own college plans, they started asking me about Stanford. I couldn't tell them much because I hadn't heard back. I grew anxious and decided to contact Stanford's admissions office to check on the status of my application. After a few days, they got back to me and told me that my application had been withdrawn. I was stunned. How could that have happened? I knew for a fact that I hadn't withdrawn it, and I told them as much. The admissions office confirmed that they had received an email, supposedly from me, requesting to withdraw the application. I couldn't believe it. It didn't make any sense. I had been careful with every step of my application process. Why would I withdraw from my dream school? Something was off, and I needed to figure out what had happened. I immediately thought of my brother. He was the only person I could imagine being petty and jealous enough to do something like this. I stormed into his room, determined to confront him. He looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I accused him of sabotaging my application. He denied it, claiming that he didn't even know how to access my email. But instead of reassuring me, his response made me even angrier. He admitted that if he had known how, he would have withdrawn all of my applications, not just Stanford, because he couldn't stand seeing me so happy about my acceptances. His arrogance and indifference only fueled my rage, and before I knew it, we were in a full-blown physical fight. Our parents heard the commotion and rushed in to break us apart. I was beyond reasoning at that point, completely consumed by frustration and betrayal. My dad had to physically hold me back as I tried to lunge at my brother again. It wasn't until my mom spoke that I finally froze in place. "We were the ones who withdrew your Stanford application," she admitted quietly, her voice shaky. I stopped struggling immediately, the weight of her words crashing down on me. I turned to face her, my mind racing, trying to process what she had just said. My own parents had done this. Why? How could they betray me like this? She started crying as she explained everything. Apparently, my brother's high school counselor had told my parents that he was in danger of not graduating unless he pulled up his grades. The counselor had also compared him to me, saying how I was on the right track, applying to business schools and having options for my future, while my brother wasn't doing nearly as well. The comparison seemed to weigh heavily on my parents, who became convinced that my success was putting too much pressure on my brother. They feared that if I got into Stanford, it would destroy my brother's already fragile mental health. He would always be the failure, compared to his successful older brother. So, in an attempt to protect him, they decided to go through my email, find my Stanford application information, and withdraw it without my knowledge. They believed that I wouldn't notice, and I didn't, at least, not until I started questioning why I hadn't heard anything from the school. I stood there in disbelief as my mom continued to sob, trying to justify their actions. My dad stood silently beside her, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to admit that they had done something horribly wrong. Even my brother, who had been smirking moments earlier, looked shocked by their confession. I'm sorry, we didn't know what else to do. We thought it was for the best. We were trying to protect your brother, my mom said through her tears, reaching out as if to comfort me. But I didn't want her comfort. I didn't want to hear any more excuses. They had stolen my chance at something I had worked hard for. They had betrayed me in the worst possible way, all because they wanted to shield my brother from feeling inadequate. I couldn't even begin to process the anger and hurt I was feeling. Without saying another word, I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't stop to listen to their apologies or explanations. I went straight to my room and started packing. There was no way I could stay in that house any longer. I needed to get out of there, away from the people who had hurt me so deeply. As I packed, my parents kept knocking on my door, begging me to come out and talk to them. But I ignored them. I couldn't face them. I called a cab and left without saying goodbye. My destination was my grandparents' house. They had always been more supportive of me than my parents, and I needed their help now more than ever. When I arrived at my paternal grandparents' home, I broke down in tears for the first time since learning the truth. My grandparents were horrified when I told them what had happened. My grandpa immediately called my parents and yelled at them for what they had done. Meanwhile, my grandma sat with me, comforting me as I cried. I felt completely defeated, like everything I had worked for was slipping away. The next day, my maternal grandparents also came over, and together, all four of them discussed how to fix the situation. They assured me that they would do everything they could to help me, though they acknowledged that getting back into Stanford at this point would be nearly impossible. What they could do, however, was ensure that I wouldn't have to worry about the financial burden of college. They offered to cover all of my tuition and living expenses, which was a huge relief, as I had been planning to take out loans and work part-time to pay for school. Their support meant the world to me, but they didn't stop there. My grandparents were so angry at my parents that they decided to go even further. They told me that they were planning to cut my parents out of their wills and name me as their sole heir. I was stunned. I had never expected anything like this. It was their way of showing me that they were on my side, that they disapproved of what my parents had done, and that they wanted to ensure I was taken care of. A few days later, my parents called me, not to apologize, but to blame me for snitching to my grandparents. They were furious that my grandparents had cut them off and were transferring the inheritance to me. They demanded that I fix the situation, but I wasn't interested in hearing their demands. I had spent too long feeling like I was second to my brother, and now that I had the support of my grandparents, I wasn't about to give it up. I told my parents that they deserved everything that was happening to them. They had made their choice when they decided to sabotage my future. I gloated, rubbing it in their faces that I was going to get the inheritance and that they had no one but themselves to blame for losing it. My parents screamed and cursed at me, but I didn't care. I hung up on them and blocked their numbers. For the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand in this dysfunctional family dynamic. Later, I told a few of my friends about what had happened, expecting them to side with me. But to my surprise, some of them told me that gloating was unnecessary, that I could have handled the situation with more dignity. They said I should have just accepted my victory quietly and moved on without rubbing salt in the wound. I didn't expect that reaction, and it left me feeling conflicted. Part of me was still angry and wanted to lash out at my parents, but another part of me wondered if my friends were right. Had I gone too far by gloating? Should I have just let my grandparents' decision speak for itself without antagonizing my